Hello, this is TelecomTV. I'm Martin Warwick. We're at Broadband World Forum 2016 in Excel in London's Docklands. What a fine place it is. And I'm talking with a good old friend, Don Clarke, who is the chair of the ETSI NFV Network Operator Council, among other things. And we'll come to the other things in due course, Don. But first of all, great to see you again.
Likewise.
Right, 4 years since NFV burst upon the scene. What do you make of what's happened in that, what seems in some ways like an age, because we've been focusing on it for so much, but also seems to have gone like a couple of days?
It seems like yesterday, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We published a white paper in October 2012,
yep.
And then we launched the forum in Darmstadt at the SDN OpenFlow World Congress, which has now been renamed the SDN World Congress, and I was in The Hague last week at that conference, and that's exactly 4 years to last week since we launched that paper, and it's amazing what's happened, hasn't it? If you now look around the industry, you see every vendor product has got some element of virtualization there, and we're at the Broadband World Forum, and I like coming to this conference because it takes me back to my roots in BT R&D, where I led quite a lot of the work here, actually VDSL and G.fast, a few things that I've actually personally driven as well, and this is the major conference for all of that. But of course, access is, people think of it as wires and cables and optical fibres. What they don't really think about is compute being applied to this. And sure enough, there was quite a lot of resistance in the access community 4 years ago. They said, well, what's all this compute stuff anyway? This is all about wires and modems. But now we're seeing actually products here that represent and reflect the work that we've been doing in ETSI over the last 4 years. They actually embody that work. And we're right in the middle of the access industry, so that's really gratifying to see that.
Excellent stuff. So Don, what else have you been doing? I know you've got a lot on your plate because you've got more than one job, but what have you been, we were talking off camera and you were talking about that you've been doing a lot of work on interfaces and architecture. Why the emphasis on that?
So the reason we brought ETSI NFV into being 4 years ago was really, first of all, to converge requirements. So get every operator on the planet aligned that this was the future for networking, and that's really necessary because vendors have, existing product roadmaps. Those roadmaps look several years ahead, and we needed to make sure that they got a consistent message from the network operators that this was the future for networking. So that was the first challenge, was to create convergence of requirements, and we did that pretty early on. Within about 9 months, we released converged requirements to the industry. Then we realized almost immediately that interoperability was going to be challenging, because we're not now talking about physical interfaces, we're talking about virtual interfaces. And how do you do that? How do you make sure there's interoperability? So the work evolved from requirements into how we create interoperability. And interoperability is important for lots of different reasons. In our industry particularly, we want to have best-in-class vendors in different domains. But their equipment needs to interoperate. And if the domain is a server infrastructure, you're looking at a virtual network function from one vendor needing to connect and interoperate with a virtual network function from another vendor, or even multiple vendors. So how do you do that? What do you actually need to do in order to make that happen? Well, you need to specify the interface. But to specify the interface, you need to understand the architecture. So we did actually paint an architecture, which is called the NFV Architectural Framework, which was published in October 2014. And since then, we've developed more and more detail in that architecture, particularly around management and orchestration. And as we've moved forward, we've realized that ETSI NFV itself needs to do work we never really anticipated doing. And that was to actually specify the bits and bytes that flow across those interfaces. Originally, we thought that those interfaces would be specified in application-specific standards bodies like Broadband Forum or MEF or IETF. But actually, as we've realized, those forums themselves aren't set up to do that. So we've actually, over the last year, started to do the work of specification at the very detailed level. So the forum has evolved over the last 4 years into something which I didn't expect, which is effectively something more akin to a standards body in order to do that. But we're going to do it much more quickly than has been done in the past.
Thank you. Also, you were talking about NFV license management. Tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm right, but we know that the industry is dominated by certain big vendors, and there are a lot of smaller fry out there who also have something valuable to give but may not be able to get a look in, really. Does what you're doing with license management help those smaller vendors?
License management is absolutely critical here. Originally in BT we talked about license management. In fact, in the total cost of ownership model that we developed as part of our research, we identified licensing as being a major element of the cost. And of course that's a recurring cost, and therefore the sensitivity of that model is highly dependent on license management. But over the last 3 years it's been kind of parked as an issue. Because we hadn't really got, that wasn't seen as a high priority to begin with, because there are mechanisms you can use to start moving it without having standardized license management mechanisms. But about a year ago, I was presenting a conference in California. A small vendor came up to me and he said, Don, a big problem for us is license management, because we can't compete with the big players who have the ability to negotiate very complicated license management regimes. And when the network operators come to us, they ask us to try and provide them with agreements and deals that are impossible for us to even manage, let alone create the mechanisms for that. So that set in my mind that we really need to address this. And then about 3 months ago, Korea Telecom appeared at a Network Operator Council meeting that we were chairing, that I was chairing, and they actually asked the Network Operator Council to help them get a new work item started in ETSI on license management, and I've welcomed that. So over the last 3 months with Korea Telecom and others, we've specified a new work item that got started actually in Sophia Antipolis a few weeks ago, and we're going to progress that work over the coming 6 months.
Another question I was going to ask you is this. There is now, I believe, a focus on security in a way there wasn't before. I know things have to be done in a certain order when you're virtualizing, or everything that's happening in various virtualization technologies, cloudification, etc. But one would have thought that perhaps an emphasis on security would have been there from the start, considering how important it is. Is that the case? It
was there. In fact, if you look back over some of my interviews, Martin, I've talked about this several times.
You have.
In fact, the first working group that was started was the security expert group. In fact, we called it an expert group. We didn't want it to be a working group, but actually morphed into a working group, and it's chaired actually by CableLabs under Igor Feinberg. But I guess where I'm coming with this is that over the last year, as people begin to look at some of the more recent security threats that have emerged, for example, IoT, DDoS attacks, people have started to look at how these might be mitigated, and strangely enough, but not strange to me at all, was that NFV and SDN technologies actually enable you to do things that you couldn't do previously. You can isolate resources, you can actually take resources down that have been compromised, you can spin them up in a safer environment and start all over again. And so people begin to realize that the techniques that we've been developing are actually applicable to security. So that's one driver. And then the other driver is, as the industry recognizes that the future of networking is virtual, how are you going to do things like lawful intercept? And how are you going to ensure that you can have trusted domains for accessing this stuff, right? In the old days of networking, you lock the door, right? And you can't go into that room because it's got your sensitive equipment in it. Yeah. But now the whole data center is your locked room, and how do you lock bits of the infrastructure up that are virtualized? So there's been a big uptick in security, and even today within CableLabs, we've identified another area that we would like ETSI to look at, and we're going to bring forward some work in ETSI to do that. So the security area is just building in intensity now, which I welcome.
A couple more questions. We're here at Broadband World Forum, as we said, and there's always a theme emerges, or you see products which you haven't seen before, or which have been refined, or completely new, whatever they may be. And it seems to me there's been a lot of stuff on the notion of the central office mutating or evolving into a data center. Is that what's happening?
Absolutely, and in fact that was inevitable, wasn't it? Because a lot of network equipment is actually located in central offices or nodes. We call them in the UK exchanges, don't we? So we always anticipated this. And in fact, one of my early slide packs has got a picture of a central office, and next to it there's a picture of the data center, and there's kind of like an arrow that says this is the future of the central office. Yeah. But what we're actually now seeing is a number of operators around the world are actually architecting their central office strategy based around virtualization. So, for example, here at the Broadband World Forum, which is an access-related conference, I've seen some pretty interesting products actually that take the central office re-architected as the data center really seriously, and are actually demonstrating products here based on that. So that really is something that I guess gives form to the physical instantiation of this stuff, really. It's to say that in the telco world, we have buildings. I remember from my BT days about 5,000, right? 5,000 exchanges.
Yeah.
In the future, they're going to have racks of servers in them, and then maybe even a deeper place in the network, maybe even the cabinets, you might see these kind of things, and certainly at radio base stations. So the idea that compute nodes will appear in network places is inevitable, but also you get advantages with that. You get, for example, the ability to aggregate bandwidth, that it's based on the applications that are being served at that point. So you could potentially cache applications at those nodes, cloud applications. We could cache storage at those nodes, and then you reduce latency, and there's really interesting ways to architect, I guess, service application aware. And that's pretty obvious from this conference that that's really been taken up by the vendors.
Finally, Don, I'm going to let you change your virtual or metaphorical hat or whatever it is. Now, you mentioned CableLabs. Of course, you work with CableLabs and for CableLabs. What's happening there at the moment? What are you particularly looking at?
Well, I joined CableLabs 2.5 years ago and I haven't looked back. It's a great place to work and I really enjoy my work there. I'm part of a small team that's driving the strategy for virtualization for both CableLabs and cable operators who are the consortium that own CableLabs. I guess the most exciting development has been the fact that we can now do interoperability in our Curio subsidiary, which was formed in January this year. So Curio has got an Interop Lab, and the R&D team, of which I'm part, is working with cable operators to develop strategy for interoperability for cable-centric network functions. So that's an area where I see strong growth for CableLabs as being relevant to the industry. It provides a service for the industry. And in addition to that, of course, we've got some pretty exciting areas of R&D, which no doubt I'll be talking to you about in the future.
Well, I certainly hope so. As usual, Don Clarke, thanks very much.
Thanks, Martin.